And right now, we are 2 minutes away from the end of the trading day. Romaine Bostick alongside Alix Steel. We're counting you down to the closing bell. Here to help take us beyond the bell. It's a global simulcast. Scarlet Fu joining us in Studio 2. Massar and Tim Stenovec bringing up the rear. Welcome to our audiences across all of our Bloomberg platforms. You know, we've had a lot of mad days, Carol, over the last few days and weeks, but today really broke that streak.
Yeah, absolutely. Really interesting day, right? And I feel like, of course, it all kicked off this morning with the inflation print that did come in hotter than forecast. And then, of course, you got the Fed minutes. But it's interesting to see kind of the movement we've seen kind of bouncing around on the equity side of things. But if you look at the Treasury curve, very clear message about higher for longer and higher rates, everybody.
Yeah, it's pretty remarkable to see that, you know, just back in December, folks were talking about potentially 6 rate cuts this year. Now, Scarlett, I think many will be surprised if we see 3 rate cuts this year. 2 is potentially what's going to happen. You have folks like Torsten Slok coming out with a note this morning saying we're sticking to our view that the Fed will not cut rates in 2024.
And there's some people who also... There are also some people who say that maybe the Fed needs to consider talking about raising rates, maybe not out loud, but that also kind of is always a prospect. It really sets up the day in an interesting way for tomorrow's wholesale inflation number as well. Is that going to move the needle?
Well, yeah, I don't know. I mean, I would say maybe, but then economists always say you don't know. PPI never moves the needle. But I just want to, just to your rate cut point there, Scarlett, because, I mean, you go through WIRP and you look at what the swaps market is pricing in. We're now basically priced in for 2 rate cuts this year. That's what the market is expecting. But more importantly, you don't have any real consensus as to when that really kicks off. I mean, everyone's now looking to September, but that's not even a slam dunk.
Does it really matter when, or does it matter how many? No one's taking out a cut for the whole cutting cycle. It's just a matter of pushing it back.
I think it matters because, I mean, you get to this, I mean, if you believe this idea that the Fed doesn't want to get in the way of an election cycle, and if they're not going to start until September, then how much wiggle room does that give them? Do they just do a 50 in September and start, or do they just be brave enough and just say, we're just ignoring the election, we're going to do whatever we need?
Hey, the market's closed.
The market is closed here, Carol Massar, and so let's walk through the numbers.
We were really engaged in that conversation.
The Dow Jones Industrial Average is going to close down on the day, off the lows of the day, but still down 1%, 422 points lower than where it was yesterday. The S&P 500 down 49 points, or about 1%. The NASDAQ Composite down about 0.8%. But the biggest decliners out there were in your cyclical space. Dow Transport's down 2%. S&P 400 Midcaps down 2%, and the Russell 2000 closing out the day down 2.5.
All right, we're going to get to the sector performance in just a moment, but just again, staying kind of macro on the S&P 500. Big picture, 431 names in the index, Scarlett, to the downside, 72 to the upside.
Yeah, and looking at the IMAP, lots and lots of red. You have 11 sectors, only 1 finished in the green, and that's barely. Energy up by 0.3%, thanks to rising oil prices. WTI surpassing $86 a barrel. In terms of the leading underperformers, real estate investment trust losing more than 4%. Utilities, another interest rate sensitive group, down 1.75%, and materials off by 1.5%.
All right, guys, let me get to some of the individual gainers. Number 1 gainer in the NASDAQ 100 was NVIDIA, also a top performer in the S&P 500. NVIDIA, this is coming from Morgan Stanley, saying it's the best way to get exposure to artificial intelligence as visibility into strong spending continues to build. Again, Morgan Stanley saying this in a note. They reiterated their overweight rating on NVIDIA while raising its price target to $1,000 a share from $795 a share. NVIDIA finishing the day just shy of a 2% gain, closing at $870 and change. All right, let's go to GE, if we may. That stock up about 1.4% in today's session. This, again, was a top performer in the S&P 500, at least earlier in the day. Company we know created following the spinoff last week of GE and the spinoff of GE Vernova, which is the renewables business. So GE, again, up 1.4%. Didn't really find any specific news, but yesterday, GE Aerospace, which is now the GE ticker, upgraded to buy from holdover at Cowen, highlighting the company's position as a market leader in commercial jet engine technology and its extended aftermarket visibility. They raised the price target to $180 from $175. The stock, by the way, ticker GE, is up about 54% so far this year. And while on the subject of GE, or formerly, or, you know, it's now kind of all its new iterations, if you will, GE Vernova, ticker GEV, that stock was up about 4.7%, a top gainer, I think the number 1 gainer in the S&P 500. Again, no real news on it, but just interesting to see once again that in a market where there was some stress maybe today and risk off, that's where we saw investors putting some effort.
All right, well, let's talk about some of the notable decliners. In the S&P 500, among the worst performers were major U.S. tech and internet stocks. We saw shares of Apple fall 1.1%, Tesla down 2.9% today. Shares of Microsoft falling today by 0.7%. This all happening after that latest CPI data came in hotter than expected, suggesting that the Fed is going to delay interest rate cuts until later this year. I do want to talk about Deckers Outdoor, the worst performer on a percentage basis in the S&P 500. Apparently, people aren't buying those Hokas like they used to. Truist came out. They have the credit card data, and they said that it signals direct-to-consumer growth of the Hoka sneaker brand slowed in the middle of February and remains softer through March. Shares down more than 6% on the day today. Should note that Deckers Outdoor also owns UGG, Teva, Sanuk, and more.
And apparently, UGG demand for UGGs is still pretty solid. So.
They're classic. What can I say?
Yeah, good for those teenage
girls.
girls.
It's a staple in the closet. I'm just going to say that.
Certainly in the Northeast.
Big in California, too, for those surfers. Delta Airlines, ticker DAL, reported earnings earlier today. And it was interesting because earnings surpassed expectations. The stock moved as high as 4% to the upside in the trade. But then a little later in the day, it started moving lower, ended up closing down by 2.3%. This after the inflation data came out, showed that airfares dropped more than 7% in March from the previous year. It was the biggest increase, or the biggest decrease rather, since November. Separately, we saw oil move higher. Jet fuel, of course, one of the airline industry's biggest expenses.
All right, let's take a look at the bond market, because that's where a lot of the action really emanated from, guys. You had the sell-off, a pretty broad base, but really in the front end in particular, you saw a move of about 22 basis points. That was the biggest move we've seen on the day since the SVB crisis about a year ago. The 10-year yield saw the biggest move, about 18 basis points. We haven't seen that since September of 2022. So lots of really big superlatives, guys, as sort of like the big moves, the chunky moves in the bond market. We're like kissing 5% now on the 2-year SCAR.
Yeah, some mammoth moves in the bond market there. There are still some earnings crossing the wire. Let's talk about Rent the Runway, which, of course, had a reverse stock split just earlier this month. Fourth quarter revenue, or its fiscal fourth quarter revenue, I should say, $75.8 million, slightly higher than what analysts were looking for, which was $74.5 million. Adjusted EBITDA of $11.2 million, almost double what analysts were looking for. As for the outlook for this quarter, Rent the Runway sees 73 to 75 million. That is shy of what analysts were looking for, which was 75.9 million. And revenue growth of between 1% to 6% for fiscal year 2024. They got to convince people to shell out anywhere from $90 to $200 a month to keep those fashion subscriptions going.
Yeah, it's interesting, too. And I'm just looking at the stock in the aftermarket, up about 9.5%. It was down about 30% year to date here. So it's been under a lot of pressure. And you've got about 20% of the float being shorted. So anybody who was maybe counting on it not being so great, maybe doing a little bit of short covering right now.
The company coming out and saying that customers have been buying more inventory, customer retention has markedly improved year over year, and that the premium personal concierge service to style customers made it easier for customers to discover inventory that they love and created more aspirational product experience.
All right, guys, next time you go to order your latte at Starbucks, you're going to have to whisper, because apparently they are creating designs within some of their stores, basically to curb noise. They want to make order taking or order giving, if you will, easier, because apparently some of the orders are coming out wrong. And I guess people who are taking the orders and so on and so forth, the baristas, they're not hearing it clearly, and that actually costs them money.
Well, also what's interesting on this one, too, is maybe if their drinks weren't so complicated, it wouldn't be a problem.
Half double decaf with a double mocha twist?
I can never order correctly.
So, like, if you didn't have to order for 20 minutes, maybe you could hear them better.
Or maybe they should call a small, and a medium, a medium.
Yeah, totally agree with that.
Is this
100%.
Seinfeld?
Yes.
Is this Seinfeld? Are we watching Seinfeld?
I was surprised to see this, given the growth of online and mobile ordering, that people still ordered using their voices. I thought it was all just done over the phone.
I actually find the story fascinating, too. I mean, there was a story just a couple days ago about how another food chain, Polo Campero, had actually tried to find ways to sort of make its ordering process more efficient.
Yeah, got to decrease those
reducing
steps,
the
right?
amount of steps that folks had to take, people working there had to take, and in theory, you get your order faster. So, look, I guess you experiment with what you can. I haven't been in a Starbucks in a while, but if it was that loud and they couldn't get the order right, then maybe it works.
Romaine sends his team to get his Starbucks. That's how important he is.
I would think they want to keep it loud. I would think they want to keep it loud to prevent people from sort of camping out with their laptops in there. and just like taking up all the seats for the whole day?
They do that anyway. Noise canceling headphones.
Oh yeah, okay.
How do I get a team? How do we get a team?
You got a team.
We are the
We do
team.
have a great team, actually. We do have a great team. All right, guys, that is a wrap. Our cross-platform coverage on this Wednesday, radio, TV, YouTube, Bloomberg Originals. We call it Beyond the Bell. We will see you again, same time, same place tomorrow.